All right, well, good evening, everyone. We do begin the Reid Out tonight with breaking news. As you just heard Ari Melber describing just moments ago, the House of Representatives voted to strip Georgia Congresswoman and QAnon devotee Marjorie Taylor Greene from her committee posts. But the other story here is that 199 Republicans voted to back Greene despite a recent past that includes physical threats against other members of Congress, including the Speaker. It is another chapter in the tale of two parties, one focused on accountability and one that cowers in fear of its apparently extremist base. The sad truth is that Democrats in Congress had to discipline Margie Q. Greene because House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy was unwilling to do so himself. McCarthy was willing to hold a secret ballot on the fate of Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney, his own third in command, who received a resounding, if anonymous, show of support to remain in Republican leadership last night. But he couldn't muster the courage to reject the QAnon Congresswoman. With this vote tonight, House Republicans, many of whom stood up and gave Greene a standing ovation in a caucus meeting yesterday, will now be defined as supporting someone who backed calls for assassinating Speaker Nancy Pelosi and threatened the non-white women members of the squad in social media ads. She promoted an anti-Semitic and Islamophobic video that had reportedly been circulating among neo-Nazis, which claimed that, quote, an unholy alliance of leftists, capitalists, and Zionist supremacists have schemed to promote immigration and miscegenation with the deliberate aim of breeding us out of existence in our own homelands, unquote. Take that in. Mother Jones revealed that Greene was a moderator of a Facebook group that was a hotbed of violent and racist hate speech. One user posted this image of a noose in that forum with the comment, "Start with Hillary and Obama." Greene backed the conspiracy theory that the Parkland school shooting was staged. And she physically harassed an 18-year-old survivor of that shooting, David Hogg. She even said there's no evidence that a plane hit the Pentagon on 9/11. And just last month, she sat down with right-wing British columnist Katie Hopkins, expressing solidarity with someone who has compared African migrants to Britain to cockroaches. And all of this represents just a fraction of what Ms. Greene has said she believes. However, with her committee assignments on the line today, she tried to walk back at least her support for QAnon.
I stumbled across something, and this was at the end of 2017, called QAnon, and I got very interested in it. So I posted about it on Facebook, I read about it, I talked about it, I asked questions about it, and then more information came from it. The problem with that is, though, is I was allowed to believe things that weren't true. Later in 2018, when I started finding misinformation, lies, things that were not true in these QAnon posts, I stopped believing it.
Allowed by who? Her speech was heavy on excuses and short on contrition. For instance, she said the media is just as guilty of spreading lies as QAnon itself. And as if to advertise that her faux contrition on the House floor was a fraud. Just this morning, Greene played the victim in a fundraising appeal, repeating the very same kinds of lies and conspiracies about members of the squad that got her in trouble in the first place.
The gentlewoman for Georgia, as we speak, continues to fundraise off these disturbing remarks. I'm not sure what she said to the Republican conference last night, but just last night she tweeted about raising $175,000 off of this and said, quote, "We will not back down, we will never give up." That's not contrition.
For more, I'm joined by Angela Rye, former executive director of the Congressional Black Caucus, Charlie Sykes, editor-at-large of The Bulwark, and Brandon Wolf, Pulse nightclub survivor and vice president of the Drew Project. Thank you all for being here. And Angela Rye, first of all, welcome to the show. I'm really glad to have you on. And I really wanted to talk with you about this specific topic because you've been staff, you have been congressional staff. And so I am very curious what you make of what we just saw happen on the floor, where only 11 Republicans voted to strip Marjorie Taylor Greene of her committee assignments, including education, given the laundry list that I just read about the things that she has said.
Yeah, Joy, what is so crazy is people kept saying, Donald Trump is not so bad, it's fine. He's just flamboyant and arrogant and loud. But Harry Reid called Donald Trump the Republican Party's Frankenstein, and this is why. This was the beginning of the monster that was constructed and built. This was the beginning of a problem that was only getting worse, right? Like, this is something that not only the Republican Party, but really since the foundation of America, we have dealt with issues around race, white supremacy, racism, xenophobia, all of the phobias. And she is the latest version of the Republican Party's Frankenstein. So they can blame QAnon, but they also have to blame themselves. To your point, Joy, 11 Republicans voting to remove her of her committee assignments. They should be calling for her resignation. She has threatened her own colleagues. This is just fresh off of the heels of what I have been calling the Capitol Hill terrorist attack. She is part of the problem. It is people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. She said in a tweet last night, they don't like me because I'm one of you. One of you is a white supremacist. One of you is someone who would target with violence your own colleagues and then raise money off of it. That is the exact opposite direction of where this country needs to be. So instead of talking about how we're going to continue to save lives, to ensure that people can survive in the middle of a pandemic, we are talking about this woman who has demonstrated that she is ignorant, that she is a bigot, and that she will threaten people who she has to put her own voting card in right next to. That's a problem.
And the thing is, to that very point, Charlie, we're talking about a workplace on top of everything else. Marjorie Taylor Greene was still lying about the squad, who are women of color, young women of color who've been elected. You had one black woman congresswoman have to move her office because this is also somebody who evades the gun, she doesn't want to have her gun checked in and brags about being armed. Let me tell you what Steny Hoyer had to say, because he talked about the Facebook ad that she ran in which she essentially, it was sort of a fantasy about physically harming the squad members. Take a listen.
They are people. They are our colleagues. And yes, you may have disagreements, but I don't know anybody, including Steve King, who you precluded from going on committees, for much less. And this is an AR-15 in the hands of Ms. Greene. I have never, ever seen that before. I urge my colleagues to look at that image and tell me what message you think it sends.
Charlie, at this point, Republican Party candidates are getting the affirmation of all but 11 Republicans for essentially having a murder fantasy ad about people who are now her colleagues. I don't know how it gets any worse than that.
It will get worse than that, and unfortunately. Your comment about the workplace is interesting because Republicans always say they wish that government would be run more like a business. There is no business in America that would not fire Marjorie Taylor Greene for her behavior and her comments and her incitement of violence. But look, here's the Republican Party today. It is no functioning immune system to crazy whatsoever. And I thought it was interesting that Steny Hoyer mentioned the case of Steve King. Because, this is really political malpractice, this vote tonight by the Republicans. If they were concerned about political hygiene, if they were concerned about, telling the country that they were a serious governing party, they would have taken care of this themselves like they did 2 years ago when Steve King was kicked off the Judiciary and the Agriculture Committee for questioning why white supremacy was so controversial and making racist comments. Marjorie Taylor Greene is in a completely different category, but instead of doing what they did with Steve King, we have the vote tonight. So what's changed? Well, what's changed is, of course, 2 more years of marinating in conspiracy theories and lies, under Donald Trump, who has been the conspiracy theorist in chief, but also watching how those conspiracy theories lead to acts of actual violence less than a month ago. So it's really extraordinary to me that Republicans had the opportunity to clean this up themselves. They've done it in the past. They refuse to do it. And now 199 of them are on record, the ads write themselves, basically backing Marjorie Taylor Greene's position in Congress. It's a really bad moment for Republicans, but also it's a good moment, I think, to draw the line, especially after what happened on January 6th.
Well, I mean, and Brandon, it's this noxious combination of white supremacy, which Marjorie Taylor Greene isn't even embarrassed about. She didn't even, the miscegenation piece, that's an oldie but goodie from like the 19th century. But, you know, a combination of that and this mania for guns, this mania for guns everywhere. I want to play you. You are the person who alerted me to the fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene actually was a high school student when there was a gun incident in her own school. So you'd think that she'd be more understanding of it. Here she is talking about that incident, and this is part of her defense of herself today. Oh, okay. So, well, we don't have the sound of her actually defending herself, but that's okay. This happened when she was in 11th grade, and a student at her high school held other classmates hostage for more than 5 hours. She defended herself at a media interview as well as on the House floor on that today. How does that, in your way, what do you make of that as a defense? Saying that she had been in that kind of a situation in high school. What do you make of that as a defense of herself?
Well, it makes it worse. You know, what I told you initially was that I was shocked, and I think I can speak for everyone in this country that in 2021, it takes a whole lot to shock people. But I was shocked because I have been harassed by people like Marjorie Taylor Greene before. For the last 5 years, I have been stalked in public parks. I have been confronted in restaurants. I have been followed around at events. I've had phones thrust into my face asking me how I can sleep at night knowing that I invented a tragedy and the best friends that I buried in the summer of 2016. And every single time it happened, you know what I told myself? I didn't find myself angry. I just felt myself sad for those people. I told myself that it was because they couldn't process the pain of what I had been through, that they were using this conspiracy theory as sort of a way of escaping it, a way to avoid grappling with the idea that anything so horrific could happen in this country. And I told myself that if anyone had ever had to grapple with that pain of staring at an empty seat at the dinner table, they would not be capable of treating someone like they were treating me. So I was shocked when I learned that this Congresswoman, by the way, someone who helps to run one of the most powerful countries in the world, has spent the last few years traumatizing survivors like me when she is also a survivor of school violence herself all along. It is almost incomprehensible for me how she can lay her head on the pillow at night, knowing the harm that she has inflicted and continues to inflict on people who are in incredible pain.
You know, and Angela, she's to that very point. I mean, you can wield incredible power on these committees. You just lay out for us, what has she lost being stripped of these committee powers? I mean, education is pretty important, and also she's on a labor-related committee. What kind of power is she now losing?
Yeah, so the Education and Labor Committee chaired by Congressman Bobby Scott, they consider everything from wages to funding for schools, ensuring that schools are authorized at the same levels. If it's an HBCU, a TWI, an HSI, a Hispanic serving institution to a traditionally white institution, all of that is in consideration. Her ability to question and oversee the Department of Education. Of course, it's an administration that she wouldn't be too friendly towards, so she would probably really help her constituents, whoever these people are that voted for her, to ask some really interesting questions, probably conspiracy laden. I think the other thing that we should be aware of is she was also stripped from the Budget Committee, which of course ensures that they would enact the president's budget and make any revisions and changes based on wherever there may be disagreement, which there's not likely to be in the House, given they're in the same party. I think the challenge that she has now is, what do you do when you don't have committee assignments? How are you serving your constituents? How are you serving the country? How are you serving the greater good? And so to me, the real question is, why wouldn't she be expelled? Is it going to be really tough to get her expelled with two-thirds vote required? Absolutely, seeing as how most of the Republicans want her there. You know, in some ways, they wouldn't even proceed with removing her from her committee assignments through the Republican conference, which they could have done. So them taking a more courageous step to vote with Democrats to expel her, I don't think that's likely to happen.
Yeah, and really quickly, Charlie and then Brandon, you know, she had the free speech sign over her face on the mask that she's probably very reluctantly wearing. But that's the thing that she cares about the most, right? She represents a part of the conservative movement in the Republican Party that cares less about policy than they do about being able to say whatever it is they want, no matter how offensive and hurtful it is, and they feel aggrieved because they can't do it in polite society. That's all they care about, it seems.
Yeah, and they don't want to take responsibility for their words, and they don't want to be held accountable for their words or actions, and they don't think that there should be consequences. Now, until about 5 minutes ago, conservatives believed in that sort of personal responsibility. But look, she wants to play the victim. She wants to make this about the cancel culture as opposed to a consequence culture, and that's why she's raising money on all this and why her contrition was so phony. But this is a problem for Republicans, that they now reflexively regard any sort of criticism, any sort of political hygiene as an attempt to censor them. This isn't about censorship. This is about saying, if you promote violence, there is no place for you in this body. And that is not cancel culture.
And very quickly, Brandon, at the same time, they want to be able to call normal political and social, you know, things like Social Security communism. So they think that that kind of speech is okay.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. This is not a Marjorie Taylor Greene problem. This is a Republican Party problem. Let's be clear about this. Marjorie Taylor Greene is not an aberration or an outlier. She was an eventuality. This is what a lack of accountability looks like. This is the price we are all paying for political leaders embracing the white supremacist fringe in order to amass power. This is the cost of lowering the bar so far. You elect a racist, misogynist president who gets hundreds of thousands of people killed with his total disregard for the truth, all because you want to pack the courts with your favorite judges. These are Republican leaders who have for years weaponized the images of elected Democratic women of color in order to scare voters into believing that there's an America they won't recognize on the horizon. So Kevin McCarthy is wholly owned by the QAnon caucus. And the question now is, with 2 years, what can Democrats do to protect voting rights and deliver real tangible results for people?
Yeah, indeed. That is the essence of politics. Angela Rye, Charlie Sykes, Brandon Wolf, great panel. Thank you all very much.